I just wanted to give you all some good podcast recommendations. Um, it's I've been listening to podcasts for more years than most people have, so I know a lot of podcasts as far as just generally speaking. I've listened to a lot of podcasts over the years. Some don't even exist anymore, but I've learned a lot of podcasts. The most important, maybe the best podcast I've ever heard is the Bill Simmons podcast, which I've been listening to that since like 2007, 2006, 2007. The Bill Simmons podcast used to be on ESPN. Now it's on The Ringer. It is a sports podcast if you like sports. Um, Bill Simmons is one of the most articulate sports talking heads in the business. He's created the website The Ringer. He created the website Grantland originally, and he's a columnist for ESPN. And he's an amazing writer. He was an amazing writer. Now he just does podcasts and he does management stuff now. But he talks about sports. I like Bill Simmons' podcast when he interviews people who aren't in sports, like actors. Like he interviewed Ben Affleck just in the past week. He interviewed Matt Damon a couple years ago. He interviewed he interviewed Tom Hanks recently. I like when he interviews actors and like people who aren't in sports because Bill Simmons knows a lot about pop culture. When he talks about sports, he always makes pop culture references because he watches a lot of movies, he watches a lot of TV shows, he watches a lot of media in general. He doesn't just watch sports. So the Bill Simmons podcast, I like when he talks about pop culture or like he interviews musicians, like he interviews like the lead singer of Pearl Jam, I forgot his name. Um, he interviews like musicians sometimes too, and he so Bill Simmons' podcast is really good. He knows a lot about music, so he can talk really articulately about music. And the thing about Bill Simmons is he has a whole podcast network under him. So if you like the Bill Simmons Report, there's literally 100 podcasts that he's created or told people to create on The Ringer. And The Ringer has a bunch of podcasts, some about pop culture, some about movies, some about TV shows, some about music, some about politics. So the politics ones aren't very good on The Ringer, but some about media. Um, and so uh, so there's a whole bunch of podcasts that Bill Simmons has. He created The Ringer, and there's 100 different podcast hosts on The Ringer, and The Ringer is a good network if you want to look for podcasts that has a number of good ones. But a lot of them are based on sports, so if you're not into sports, but there's pop culture. There's pop culture like movies and music and stuff. So there's different stuff on The Ringer. As far as podcasts go, theringer.com. And then Spotify bought The Ringer, so I guess they're connected. So now Spotify owns a lot of those Ringer podcasts. So let me go through my list of podcasts here that I listen to on a semi-regular basis, or the ones that I've liked. Recode Media by Peter Kafka is a really good podcast about technology, new technology, and new media, and business. It's a lot about business. Recode Media with Peter Kafka. That was originally on Vox. Vox had a whole bunch. Vox is a different podcast network that I listen to a lot of. However, The Weeds was my favorite podcast probably in the past 2 years because Matt Iglesias was hosting The Weeds. Now Matt Iglesias doesn't work for The Weeds anymore because he has his own blog now. So The Weeds isn't as good now that Matt Iglesias isn't on there. But The Weeds was the best political podcast when Matt Iglesias was on there. Now, another good political podcast who used to be on Vox as well, who helped start Vox, the Ezra Klein Show. Ezra Klein Show has a New York Times opinion podcast. Ezra Klein it's another political one if you like politics. Ezra Klein knows a lot about politics. He's a liberal. If you're a liberal, you'll probably like him. I can't help you if you're a conservative. I don't know any conservative podcasts. I guess the only conservative podcast I listen to is the Joe Rogan Show. Is that what it's called? Yeah, the Joe Rogan Experience. That's the only conservative podcast I listen to. I can't help you if you're looking for a conservative podcast. The Joe Rogan Experience is the only The only one I occasionally listen to. It's an all right show if you're looking for a conservative point of view. He's alt right, right? He's the cool kid. He's the cool uncle, the cool Republican uncle. But I'm not a Republican. I'm a Democrat. But if you want a cool Republican uncle type of dude, Joe Rogan's your guy. So I'll just list all these podcasts that I've listened to over my life. There's one that's not on this list. It's I just heard Elon Musk interviewed on what was it called? Sorry, I don't edit these videos. Dan Carlin. Dan Carlin has a history podcast called Hardcore History. If you like history, that's the best history podcast I know. Dan Carlin's Hardcore History. He talks about all the great historical figures in history, all the World War II stuff, all the ancient history stuff, all the medieval history stuff. Dan Carlin's Hardcore History is probably the best history podcast I know of. If you like history, you should listen to Dan Carlin's Hardcore History. What else do I have here? Sway. Sway is the best, probably the best podcast I know right now. But Sway, Kara Swisher for New York Times Opinion hosts Sway. Kara Swisher created Recode Media, and Kara Swisher is a really intelligent technology reporter. She talks about Facebook a lot. She talks about technology a lot and how the dangers of social media. And it's not that I don't actually think social media is that dangerous, but I like to hear her opinions about the latest technology and how she thought Twitter's CEO should be fired a long time ago, and then he eventually resigned because he has other ventures. But so Kara Swisher's podcast about technology is very useful. It's called Sway. She also has a podcast that she hosts with Scott Galloway called Pivot for New York Magazine, I guess. Kara Swisher with Scott Galloway also talk about technology. Scott Galloway is a professor for NYU, and Kara Swisher is a technology reporter, and they talk about technology. They have really good chemistry, and they're really good at discussing. They also talk about political news. If you want to hear some political news from, I guess you'd say they're liberals as well. 90% of the political stuff I listen to are liberals because I'm a liberal. So Kara Swisher and Scott Galloway have really good hot takes on technology. If you want a good technology podcast, I mean technology news, I mean new media. I'm not talking about, this isn't like computer reviews or whatever. You're not going to see like camera reviews or reviews of like video games or whatever. It's about social media. It's about business. It's about the business side of technology. Who are the big players in business? Are there monopolies going on? Who's gaining control of what in technology? That's Scott Galloway and Kara Swisher have a podcast, but the better podcast is Sway with just Kara Swisher. She's by herself talking and she interviews people, but that's the better of the two podcasts she does. Scott Galloway kind of brings it down a little bit, but he's not bad. I don't think Scott Galloway is bad, but he's just not super interesting. Kara Swisher is the more interesting one of the two. So her own podcast is better than the one she does with Scott Galloway, but both podcasts are good. And Scott Galloway has a podcast by himself called the Professor G pod, where he talks about things he's passionate about. Because he is interesting in and of itself. He is interesting without Kara Swisher. Scott Galloway has his own podcast. We talk about technology and current events and all that stuff. Making Sense with Sam Harris is a podcast about philosophy. If you want a podcast about philosophy, you should listen to Making Sense with Sam Harris. He does talk about some controversial things. I wouldn't say he's a Republican. I think he's a liberal, but he's like independent on some issues that some people think Sam Harris is controversial. One of the reasons he's controversial is like he's extremely atheist. Sam Harris likes promoting his atheist ideas. I don't have a religion. He actually probably convinced me to lose my religion, so I appreciate Sam Harris for making me lose my religion. Though I still study the Bible. I still watch Catholic Church sermons on the internet, and I still study the Bible, but I'm not a Christian anymore. Thanks partially to Sam Harris. because he's one of those very vocal atheists that try to convince everyone to be an atheist or just to lose their religion for whatever reason. But anyways, he talked about philosophy on Making Sense podcast. So he does a lot of really good interviews with different people. What else? Music Exists with Chuck Klosterman and Chris Ryan. That was one of those podcasts where they only did like 12 episodes of them, and it's just about music. It's like 12 episodes where they have like, 2-hour discussions about music. Every episode is like a 2-hour discussion about music. It's a lot of very lengthy, or it's an hour and a half each one, and there's like 12 of them. It's almost like a big movie or something. But I don't think they're going to do that podcast long term, or if they are, they're just going to do it seasonally. But with Chris Ryan and Chuck Klosterman, they just talk about music. Yeah, not current music, but like older music. 60 Songs That Explains the 90s is another music podcast. It explains the guy just talks about each episode is a different song from the 90s, and they talk about all the details of what made the song special and why was it every song an important cultural moment in that time period. 60 Songs That Explain the 90s is a really good music podcast. It's in the Ringer network, so that's, if you like 90s music or you like music, you should listen to that podcast. Do I have any other music podcasts here? Flux Pod by Matthew Perpetua. I don't know how to pronounce his name, but Matthew Perpetua, Flux Pod, is a really good music podcast. He talks about music that I don't know as much about. He introduces me to new music. He doesn't actually listen to that much current music, but he knows a lot of music from the past 30 years and stuff. So Flux Pod by Matthew Perpetua. He talks about the experience of listening to music and all that entails, and he interviews many different types of people. That's Flux Pod with Matthew Perpetua is a good music podcast if you're looking for a music podcast. What else do I have here? If you're looking for a podcast that'll give you stock market advice, Motley Fool Money will give you stock market advice on which stocks are the best stocks to pick. And if you're looking for business, it talks about the different businesses and which stocks are the best businesses to invest in and make money, and the stocks that are going to pick that are grow your retirement fund and all that. So Motley Fool Money is a good podcast for stocks. What else here? That's pretty much it. So my favorite podcast right now is Sway by Kara Swisher. If you could listen to one podcast, it's Sway by Kara Fisher. If you like sports, you should listen to the Bill Simmons podcast on The Ringer. And I feel bad that Matthew Iglesias left with the Weeds podcast, because that was my favorite podcast. And the other one podcast, if I could recommend one podcast, would be Making Sense with Sam Harris. He talks about philosophy, and he can open up your mind to different ideas. He can make you woke, even though he doesn't like the word woke. He hates the word woke, but he can make you woke. This podcast used to be called Waking Up with Sam Harris, and then he didn't like the word woke, so he changed it to Making Sense with Sam Harris. Anyways, that's a good podcast. That's all I can think of right now. Let me know in the comments below, what podcasts do you listen to? What are your favorite podcasts? Let me know in the comments below. Please subscribe to this channel and be part of the community. Thank you for watching. And please leave a like video. It really helps out the channel a lot. Please leave a like underneath the video. It really helps out the channel a lot. I really like podcasts. I spend a lot of time listening to podcasts, and they have a really good effect on me. I'll maybe talk more about that in future videos. I just wanted to list a bunch of podcasts that I could think of to help you guys out if you're looking for podcasts. I know it can be hard to find new podcasts because you don't know. It's not like when you're flipping through TV channels, it doesn't automatically show you all the TV channels. You have to know in your head. You have to learn them. I add them on my Spotify account, so I can just see them on Spotify, all of them, because they're all on Spotify. So they're easier to list through than I would have been able to a few years ago. And there was a lot of other great podcasts I used to listen to years ago, but they're shut down. They're not on anymore because the business is closed down or the website's closed down or whatever. But I just want to give you the podcast I care the most about. Thank you for watching. Have a good day. Bye bye.